Hello, I'm Zach Goldstein, founder and CEO of Thanx, and I'm here with some restaurant industry experts. We are seeing an unprecedented wave of restaurant bankruptcies, both corporate and franchisee, and distressed asset sales. We do not believe there's enough discussion going on about what's really happening. What are the underlying drivers of this trend that most folks in the industry aren't talking about? And so I brought together this panel of experts to have a real unfiltered conversation to unpack what we're seeing as an industry. And frankly, to also talk about many of the bright stories that are happening in parallel to these bankruptcies. I'll let each of you introduce yourselves and then we'll just dive into a discussion. Maybe Meredith, we'll start with you.
Yeah, happy to. Hi, I'm Meredith Sandland. I'm the CEO of Empower Delivery. We are an end-to-end software platform for restaurant. But my prior experience includes a lot of things relevant to this. I spent a dozen years doing diligence for mergers and acquisitions and private equity, oftentimes restaurant and multi-unit retail, technology, and then spent 7 years as the chief development officer and in finance at Taco Bell, where I worked with a lot of franchise systems building out the brand.
Andrew.
I think we have to have the other woman in the room, of course, go first. I'm happy to be the caboose, so go ahead.
All right. Hi, I'm Ellie Doty, and I am the founder and CEO of High Impact Marketing. I'm a marketing consultant, and I embed pretty deeply into organizations and serve as interim roles as a CMO or a CDO, which is what I'm currently doing, have been for the last few years. Prior to that, I spent 20 years in restaurant marketing, QSR, and full service. In the last 10 of those, I was in the chief marketing officer role across KFC Canada, Chili's, and Burger King. So I have a marketing background when it comes to all things food and beverage.
Well, I can't wait to learn from both of these people today here, Zach. So thanks for pulling us together. My name is Andrew Smith. I'm the managing director and co-founder of Savory Fund. We are a $350 million private equity fund that invests into emerging brands across the country. We currently own 10 brands, operate several hundred units across 16 states, and are adding about 60 units of growth this year alone.
Excellent. Uh, we'll dive right in. There's some discussion of are we seeing what is effectively a COVID overhang? Is this just long-standing trends that started several years ago and now they're finally coming to fruition? And that's a complex question. The answer is undoubtedly a little bit of yes and a little bit of no. But when you see consumer preference changes in your seat as a CMO, maybe Ellie, we'll start with you and go around. What has stuck from COVID that may be driving some of this? And what of this is just, hey, we're in a new era and this is nothing to do with COVID.
Well, I would say one thing that stuck from COVID is the way consumers are expecting to access their restaurant food order. So before COVID, we were all primarily an analog experience, primarily in a restaurant or a drive-through. Um, some amount of to go and takeaway was definitely part of the business, but during COVID, I think we all saw a massive increase in to go and take away. Of course, it's one of the only ways you could get your favorites. I recall doing a major promotion on margaritas at the time, and people really wanted a margarita at home. And so I think a lot of those habits stuck. It's a huge amount of convenience for the guest, saves them a ton of time in the kitchen, and they really got to know that habit when they couldn't access their favorite brands, restaurants, and foods in a dine-in situation. So I think there's been some hangover from that behavior. Of course, in the 3 or 4 years, that has changed. The way that they're accessing that, it came on very suddenly, and since that time, I think habits have adjusted some. But that's certainly one that was a big change for I think all categories.
Yeah, it's one of the questions that I think a lot of the industry is struggling with because when we see these bankruptcies, it's ranging from quick serve all the way to even refined, polished casual. The brands are ones that everyone has heard of. Tijuana Flats, Rubio's, World of Beer, Buca de Beppo, Roti. I think just announced today, we're recording this on Tuesday, September 17th. Mary's Pizza Shack and Hawkers. The list keeps coming. And even franchisees of Subway and Arby's, Popeyes and others. Obviously, Red Lobster just emerged from Chapter 11. Um, and so, as we think about that wide range, are there trends that you are seeing that do connect those dots? Or are you seeing these are disparate situations and we really need to dive into a couple macro trends that are happening, but they're not all the same?
Well, I would say they're certainly all very different situations. However, the thing that they have in common is like, how do you end up in bankruptcy, right? You take on too much debt or fixed costs in the form of leases relative to what your business is capable of paying back. That's sort of the definition of why you would end up there. And they might have ended up in that situation for different reasons, but they've all ended up there. The part that I think is an overhang is that no one ever goes bankrupt suddenly, right? It's not like you wake up one day and you're in a situation that's untenable. You go bankrupt because you made a series of decisions, possibly 5 or 10 years ago, to do a sale leaseback on your property, to get into a debt situation that assumed you were going to grow your way out of it, to get debt at a certain interest rate that then reset to something that was unworkable, right? The decisions that were made that led to this place typically were made a long, long time ago. But then as the business changes, it becomes difficult to comply with those decisions that were made. So, a great example is what Ellie just talked about as we've moved toward greater and greater off premise, then having high fixed costs in the form of real estate is kind of tricky. If those off premise come with certain economics that are different from the assumed underlying economics of in-house business, that is also kind of tricky. But I think the part that is to me overhang really is not a COVID overhang so much as it is decisions that were made previously overhang.
Yeah, I could not agree with Meredith more. That would be exactly how I would explain the overhang issues. But I would say this: the the issue with most, we have a very interesting seat at Savory because we look at about 400 brands a year. And the thing that I'm reading in the press and what I'm seeing with our originations team is different. There are very strong brands out there making great decisions because they've been around a long period of time. So you take brands that have been around 10, 15, 20 years. Like Meredith said, those brands are not going to go out of business all of a sudden and go through bankruptcy because they made a couple bad decisions this year or because the interest rates are a little high and consumers are pulling back 5 or 10% on sales. That does not put a business that's great into the ground, into bankruptcy or out of business. The decisions that were made in 2019 and 2018 and 2017, when things were thriving in this industry, people thought, I can do no wrong. I'm going to grow. People are going to walk in the door and I'm going to make my 20+% margins. Things are great. I always tell my boys, they're now adults now, but I always told my boys when they were younger, I'm like, listen, good times come and go, and so do bad times. So I think when we're in a good, market cycle and things are amazing, people think that that's never going to turn into a bull season again. It's always just going to be bear. It's not the case. Good times go, and this is the cycle that we're in. The problem is that people made decisions in 2017, 18, 19 with debt, over leveraging themselves, increasing their SG&A, not being ready for pivots. Of course, the pandemic happens. The government then, of course, gives money to people, bolsters up some of these businesses to stay alive. So when you say, is that this kind of the overhang from COVID, the only thing I would add to what Meredith said is, I don't think it's all COVID or overhang necessarily, but decisions were made pre and post COVID being bolstered up with cash on their balance sheets to where that's all gone now and people don't have any other option because of the decisions they made 5, 8, 10 years ago. So that's all I would add.
Yeah, we tend to look at our challenges, and it's something that as an industry, the restaurant industry suffers from is a little bit of myopia, nearsightedness. We tend to look at our challenges and where we are right now. These cycles have been real. I mean, I remember when I first started working with restaurants, valuations were driven by how many doors could you open as quickly as possible. And not to put a bad name on private equity, but there were a lot of private equity folks that said, hey, we could buy those brands. We can open a gigantic number of doors. We do not need to care about how successful they are. And so we'll lever up those businesses with debt.
Yep.
That proved to be problematic. And that was a cycle 10-ish years ago. Since then, brands have been chasing top line revenue, and there's been a reset on valuations are largely set on top line growth, same store sales. Um, and I think we're going through another cycle right now because one of the things that we're seeing is what's the health of that revenue. There's a shift to what is good revenue and bad revenue. And that's not just first party, third party, though we should talk about that, right? And there's also a lot of focus on what kind of margins are you delivering, not just store level margins, but actually corporate health margins. So, Andrew, as you think about valuing businesses and looking at that pipeline, how are you changing the criteria and how might that be trickling down to some of these businesses that are still operating in a legacy mindset of where the value is as a restaurant?
So I tell people that I'm a recovering tech CEO because I'm a recovering tech CEO. I was in that for 10 years and I went through the dot-com bubble, which I feel that the dot-com bubble and the 2008 crash, there's some similarities of what we're going through now, of what we're experiencing. And I feel like people have amnesia and they don't go back and say, well, what did we learn from that time and why did it happen? And how do you come out of that cycle prevailing? And there's several things that we're doing here at Savory and that we're doing within our portfolio companies to make sure that we prevail out of this, because this is going to pass this cycle. And they're not doing that. So I think that there's a size and a performance delusion with most people right now. When you have a brand that's doing well, they think, well, we're always going to do well, so let's go take on a bunch of debt, or let's put a bunch of people on our executive team, bolster up our SG&A and be ready for growth. What happens though is that because of those dilutions, their profit margin goes down to nothing or into the negative. And they think, well, we'll fix that later. When you say what we focus on, we look at brands, and there are a lot of them right now that are doing incredibly well profitability wise and corporate profitability wise. They actually have cash flow EBITDA at the corporate level. We've met with people that have said, well, we have 23% margins at the store. I'm like, wow, that's really good right now in this market. Where are you on EBITDA as a business? And we're negative 11%, but it's okay because we have this right person and we have this tech and this. No, your business is actually, in my mind, worth nothing because you're in the hole every month. And the thing that's interesting about this industry for me is coming out of tech, you don't make anything ever. You're always raising money to burn and grow your business. In this industry, we should all be operating off of profit. Grow your business off of profits. And if you do that, when things happen like they're happening right now in the market, inflation, rates, commodity pressure, sales and traffic pressure, you can still survive it because you had healthy margins to go with and you had cash flow. But the problem that we're having right now is there's too many people that were thinking, well, this will pass. I can lose money for a while. I have reserves. Maybe like what Meredith said is everybody did the sale leaseback on their buildings in 2022 and 2023, and they had this coffer full of cash. Well, that cash is gone now and the market still hasn't turned. And that's why they have the death knell on them now.
Well, Andrew, I think that is very wise, right? The most responsible thing to do in a frankly high fixed cost industry, which is what this is to grow out of profits. But I think that is where you see restaurants reacting to a fundamental change in the market. When debt was easily available and was relatively inexpensive, it was very easy to justify for a brand that seemed on trend and was growing and had healthy unit level margins to say, we're going to fund that growth and get them to the next place. We talk about in our book separately. I wrote a book, so I'm going to refer to that for a second. But we talk about in the book the J curve restaurants and what happens, right? Like people make one restaurant and they're like, holy crap, I'm making so much money. This is awesome. I should have two. And they make a second one and it doesn't do quite as well, but it still does well. So they think, I'll do a third one. Still doesn't do quite as well. And they think, I know the problem. I can't be everywhere at once. I need an above unit operator. But to get one, they need 7 restaurants in order to pay for that. So they build a bunch more. And then they go, wow, they're really not doing quite as well. I need to start doing marketing in a much more systematic way. But they need 30 restaurants to pay for the marketing. And it isn't until restaurants, most of them, reach unit 50 or 100, where they are able to grow responsibly and pay for not just what's going on in the unit, but the corporate level as well as the CapEx to build new stores in a way that makes any sense. And I think what has changed for restaurants is if you look 5 years ago when debt was cheap and easy, there were a bunch of people out there who were willing to fund from unit 7 to 50, right? And now debt is expensive and hard, and there are not a bunch of people willing to just keep pouring cash in until the moment that the brand finally turns and it comes out of the J curve and it's in a positive cash flow situation.
That's right.
I think what you just said, Andrew, honestly, like
you said it much more eloquently. So let's go with what Meredith said, Zach. Cut my piece out.
I think one of the points that you've both made that I am not hearing as an industry us talk about the difference between store level margin and healthy EBITDA is a big one. And I'm going to bring in one more place where I'm seeing a lot of concern. We'll spend some time talking about how has third party changed this dynamic and what role is third party playing. I believe it's a critical one for all these brands that we're talking about. But one of the things we're seeing, Uber's built $1 billion ad business and it's only going to get larger. You push the easy button and you advertise on third party, you get high margin or what looks like high margin store level sales because all the cost goes to corporate. And if you're not looking at that in aggregate, it looks like, hey, we've got great growing top line and store level margins, and we're ignoring the fact that there's a cost to that revenue. And that's the good revenue, bad revenue.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't
a-
even know that all the margin at the store level is good, right? Because to the extent that those ads are doing BOGO or discounts or 25% off or $5 off 50 or whatever it is, that discount typically is being eaten at the store level. And interesting, like I used to be in finance at Taco Bell, right? There was no such thing as a discounts line. There was no difference between gross sales and net sales. And I like never saw that in restaurants. And all the diligence that I did for all the years that I was at Bain, all the years at Taco Bell at Yum, never saw that. And now there is a distance between gross sales and net sales that is a discounts line. Where did that come from? I think most of it came from third party, but maybe also from, trying to drive first party sales and bring people over there in reaction to the third party. And that is something that's new. So yes, you are absolutely accurate, Zach. There is a bunch of above restaurant costs that's being spent. But there is also, I think, some in-restaurant cost that is damaging to the quality of the revenue, as you would say.
Great. As you think about that um, effort to grow top line, Ellie, and it's one of the things that the marketing team is tasked with. Grow my top line, grow my same store sales, right? But there's a dance. It's far more nuanced than just singularly chasing top line. How has that dance changed in the last couple of years with the arrival of third party? We now know it's not purely incremental, so it can't just be push that button. How are you thinking about things differently in the CMO seat in that dynamic?
Well, there's a few things to start with. As we talk about that, one is that we exist in a share stealing category. So the first thing to note is the only place you're going to grow is really from stealing from somebody else. So you're stealing an occasion, you're stealing a channel, you're stealing something. You're not organically grow. The category is not organically growing. So what if you're in a share stealing situation? You have a handful of options to grow. One is I can get this same set of people that are already visiting me to spend a little bit more money with me visiting here. That would be check. Or I can get them to come a little bit more often, or I can get new people who weren't visiting me before to come, which is traffic. So from the CMO seat, and I think from most seats in the business, you want to be growing from traffic, not from check necessarily. You want people who love you to come more often, to be able to access your options for more of the occasions in their lives, as well as, steal some people who may not have thought of you for the occasion that you're introducing. So the first thing I would say is that if you can grow traffic by stealing share, that's the way. That's a good healthy top line growth. Once you have that context set, you start to understand now why we take the actions we do when it comes to introducing an entirely new channel, entirely new way to access my great margaritas or whatever the case may be. And third party is one of those. A few years ago, it was an entirely new way to access an entirely new audience. So they call it a marketplace for a reason. It's a new marketplace. So that's how we get into this is I want these new people. I want this new occasion. I'm willing to go a pretty far distance to participate there. And then over time, we see all your competitors are now on this marketplace as well. So since you're in a share stealing category, your share is being stolen by all of these other competitors. So this flywheel gets in motion and we start being willing to compromise on the per transaction margin you're getting because your belief system is I'm getting an occasion I would not otherwise get from a guest I may not otherwise get in a setting where my competitors are going to get that occasion if I don't participate. So that sort of sets up like how we end up getting here. My experiences have mostly been in franchised organization, and in that situation, there is pass-through costs of the transaction to the franchisee at the restaurant level. So their four-wall EBITDA is affected by the discount, the take rate essentially from participating on the third-party marketplace, which makes them kind of an unpopular transaction at the restaurant level, as you might guess. So the franchisee definitely wants to have a transaction that's not on a third party. So not to go too deep on that, but what we end up doing is a first party transaction. So that way we can meet that occasion, but put you in my channel. So theoretically, you gain somebody at a lower profit transaction and shift them into a higher profit transaction. So that's where a lot of the plans lately have sought to move into. But of course, it's very different dynamics for a guest to go to a third party versus to come to your app, especially in a low commitment category like restaurants. You just don't want to have that many apps in your phone and you don't want to navigate to that many mobile web pages. So a marketplace is a handy way to access them. That means in some, essentially, it's wonderful to see traffic growth on the top line that comes from any channel at all. Over a longer period of time, when you can't command the price points, the fees, the value that is required in that channel any longer, that's when you come back to what my friends here have been talking about. If your business model wasn't set up to handle that in the long term, it's not sustainable. You can't make your way through it.
This is where these threads start weaving together, because if your real estate footprint is overweight for an increasingly off-premise business, that's a cost that is tough to bear when you're also bearing the cost on the third-party marketplace. If you are making assumptions that you could just raise prices on third party and that could protect your margin, but the repeat frequency of those guests is far lower, that is a lifetime value assumption that plays out in the model. And it doesn't play out with the snap of your fingers. It plays out over a couple years as those customers slowly move basically to other places. As Ellie just said, in a stealing share environment, one of the things that marketplaces are very good at is moving share around back and forth between players. And so, Meredith, you've thought a lot about this and the changing dynamics. I think we often together and often in the wilderness, but we're getting there, are trying to help the industry see that there is a dynamic with third party that can be healthy, but you have to make some assumptions that they are also your competitor. Where are some places that some of these brands aren't making those assumptions and falling short?
Yeah, I think, if you listen to the story that Ellie just told about how we got here, there are a number of brands who have concluded that they need to get what I'll call their fair share on third party. And so are doing offers in order to grab that share that maybe aren't healthy. And I think that makes some of these players a little bit irrational and then drives the rest of the market to try to respond to it, because they're either going to give up, quote unquote, their fair share, or they're going to have to compete and give an equally compelling offer. The problem for the restaurant industry is that as they give those offers in what they believe is to get their fair share of people who are going to go to the marketplace anyway, what the marketplaces are turning around and doing is giving those offers to consumers so that consumers will keep coming to the marketplace, right? So as long as everyone in the industry is trying to get their fair share and therefore is giving away all kinds of awesome, BOGOs and dollar off and percent off and all these free delivery and all these other things, and the restaurant is funding it, the marketplaces get to use those offers to say, look what a good deal this is, come back to my app.
Well,
Classic.
only thing I would add, Zach, to what both of them say, because I can't add much, but from an operating standpoint, since we operate our brands too, I think that the brands that are running to third party too right now they're in the desperation mode. They're like, I gotta get sales, so let's get all three PDs set up. Let's increase our prices, like you said, but it's all short term sighted. And I can't say that we're not victims to that, and some of our brands executive teams feeling like, well, if I do this for some time, I get the traffic, I get the habitual customer coming in the door, and then I start to titrate them off of that because they'll be on my system, my native system, or they'll be used to eating my food and coming back, it actually doesn't work. So all I can tell you is you plan for that, and I think that we all have talked about. Hopefully, that's the plan with 3PD, is that it brings traffic back to our restaurants. But I actually don't think that. I think that the 3PD consumer is one that's looking for a deal. And I think that when we talk about, we're stealing and sharing, like you said, Ellie, I agree with that. We're stealing and sharing, but are we stealing and sharing the customer that's just looking for the next new deal, but they're really not going to be a loyal customer? And that's where you come in, Zach, of what creates a loyal customer and how do we know that they're going to come back to us? Just sharing around customers that are never going to come back to me unless I make zero profit on them, that also hurts my business. And I think that that's another reason, like, some of these businesses have gone bankrupt, is because they can't service what they have. They're scrambling and doing things that are not profitable, when what they really should do is focus on their core of their business and becoming a profitable business again, and not worrying about trying to increase top line when there is no bottom line. That's just not going to help you get out of that circular evolution to the drain.
Um,
It's
I
Go ahead,
can
Ellie.
add,
Sorry.
to, yeah, I can add to that if you don't mind, just quickly, that something I didn't mention, but these two have put me in the thought of, often what happens if you increase dramatically your off-premise business. A lot of brands may underestimate not only the costs that go along with it, but also the operational concerns that go along with it, which also have costs over the long term. So you actually end up creating a really negative guest experience overnight. They're paying more for food that's cold and wrong, and they can't get it corrected, and it takes way longer to get there than they thought. And that's just, restaurant 101. That's not a recipe for a devoted occasion. And so I've just seen the pattern sometimes where you think, I'm hungry for this top line growth. It's a new channel. I can get on this marketplace. But if you're not actually doing the work of making that a great experience for your guest, then they're not going to come back to it. For further bolstering, it's a short term win.
Yeah, I think in many ways that's what's happened to Starbucks here in the US, right? I mean, obviously they're not going to go bankrupt. They're doing just fine, but part of what's happening with the brand is, as they added on these very convenient channels, the restaurants in a lot of ways became e-commerce fulfillment centers. Well, guess what? No consumer wants to hang out in an e-commerce fulfillment center. And PS, the stuff that you are getting from the e-commerce fulfillment center, like you said, Ellie, maybe is colder than you expected, older than you expected, and
Not quite
maybe
right. You thought it
not
would
quite
be.
right.
Yes,
Yeah,
beautiful app, let you know you could get anything you wanted, but if that's not
amazing.
connected to the execution.
Correct.
When you talk to the folks that have been excellent evaluators of the next hot restaurant, investors, operators, et cetera, they'll tell you there's this virtuous cycle when you see a restaurant humming, and you can't quantify it, right? It's just the in-store operations is working, the customers are delighted, the innovation is going, and when all those things go together, one plus one equals like 17, and you get these incredible stories. There's a negative cycle, the opposite virtuous cycle, where these things all kind of compound. You get addicted to the bad revenue just to keep top line going because you got to justify your fixed costs. And then you're unable to deliver that delightful experience to guests with consistency, which makes them less likely to come in, which makes you more desperate to chase top line. And uh, there are a number of the brands on the list that have been bankrupt or sold at a fire sale price, to avoid bankruptcy recently. That at least part of their story is that. And so my question for all of you is, in the seat of a uh, CFO, CMO, owner, it's so easy to chase one of those elements of that cycle and go for it. Um, how do you get the teams at these restaurants to zoom out? What are the mistakes that maybe not all of these brands, but that they didn't zoom out far enough to see the big picture? And as Ellie just pointed out, how one thing impacts the next. And if they're all going the wrong direction, it's really hard to get out of that cycle.
I don't think a lot of these brands are being transparent, to be honest. I think that it's being stuck at the senior level. And I think that part of the problem is that a lot of these brands, they would probably act differently. They would probably have different accountability measures in place so that it didn't serve the bottom up approach to being bankruptcy as the only option out. And I think that with all brands, if senior leadership, even from the board level all the way down to your GMs in the stores, were on the same page and there was transparency about what was going on with the business and how to really build the brand, it would work better. We have brands right now in the portfolio and other brands we're talking to right now that are absolutely crushing the market on same store sales and transactions, and they're discounting nothing. They discount nothing. And when you look at why they're able to get to that point, it's because they're building that loyalty with that customer so that, like Ellie said, they keep coming back to you because there's a relationship there. So I don't think the brands that are really truly winning Kava, I don't think Brett over at Kava is discounting the hell out of Kava. I don't think that that's what's working for Kava. So everybody thinks, well, I'm not like that. I have to use coupons or I have to discount or I have to use 3PD to survive. Maybe you have a fundamental business issue that's going to be just this long death spiral for your brand. Maybe you need to just get shocked a little bit and say, we really need to look at who we are, what we are, because maybe we're not around in 5 years either. And maybe bankruptcy is our choice, or just shutting the doors because we're not making decisions today to be a long-term brand for our consumers anyway.
Hmm. I totally agree with that. I think it is the opposite of the virtuous cycle, Zach, is the doom loop. And the doom loop to me tends to start with heavy discounting because you are attracting, by definition, disloyal customers who what they value about you is that discount. And you are not paying attention to and investing in the customers that you want, which are the ones that love you for who you are and want to show up because you're a great brand and you execute well and you have good food. So to me, like if you could point at one thing on that doom loop, on that circle of what's not going well, if you could say we're having to do a lot of discounting, whether it's on third party or not, that's probably the red flag that makes you go, wait a minute, what's happening here and where is this likely to lead?
I would just, the only thing I would add here probably is that it is possible to be a strong brand and a value leader at the same time. We see a lot of super successful brands in all categories that are able to lead on, I will give you a good value and you can count on me for it. However, when the doom loop that Meredith introduced there starts to be a combination of discounting beyond profitable, sustainable, everyday value your guests can count on and know they can get from you reliably. You're beyond that, starting to see lots and lots of value stacked on top. I won't even say value, lots and lots of discounts stacked on discounts, stacked on discounts in lots of different channels, possibly not reliable over time that changes, every 6 weeks or so, you've got a different thing you're discounting, is one. And then I would just add to that the other trap is buying lots and lots of external media, which is also a challenge to profit and in many categories. And the more you have to buy, the more the next year you have to buy more, and the next year you have to buy more to continue to grow. And those two things sort of go hand in hand in my mind. That the ones that are really organically creating amazing experiences that solve challenges for their guests and become part of their lives often don't need to participate necessarily in some of those things that can be very costly and impactful to the bottom line.
Yeah, I think that's a
That
great
is,
shout that there's a difference between being a value player and being a discounter. And I think I
Yes.
would point to
Yeah.
retail and all the bankruptcies that happened there almost almost to the one. What you would see is this crazy high-low strategy where the retailer would be everyday pricing very high and then doing massive discounting to try to pull people in, and then ultimately they would go bankrupt, right? And
Right.
there are so many of those in the retail industry. And Carl, my co-author, and I think people often say, like, how do you know what's going to happen in restaurant? It's really easy. Like, look at what happened in retail and travel, and you just say, how would this play out in restaurant? And many, many, many retailers have gone bankrupt over the last 10 years in response to e-commerce. And why? Because they didn't deal with it correctly, right? They didn't make a great online experience. They didn't back it up, Ellie, as you said, with a great fulfillment experience. And even if something goes wrong, returns experience. And instead, they went to this high-low model of discounting, of trying to pull traffic in. And that ultimately led to their demise.
that is, and I say this to some members of my team, and they looked at me with a blank stare. That is the Bed Bath and Beyond effect, as I often talk about.
Yeah.
And we all know it. You reached a point in as a customer of Bed Bath and Beyond where you would never go to Bed Bath and Beyond without a discount. And that's training the customer into a very dangerous cycle. I think there's a couple things that you've both mentioned here. Chasing new customers. Obviously, every business needs to grow by acquiring customers, but there's a reason that it is the third thing that Ellie said there, and that your focus was on traffic from existing customers, right? Any healthy marketing mix has to be driving successful reactivation of customers who already know you, because the acquisition costs are so much cheaper to get an incremental customer or an incremental visit from an existing customer. One of the things that I think many of these restaurants that are struggling right now are doing is are chasing new customers just on the hope that if we get trial, oh, they'll keep coming in. And as Andrew pointed out, if you haven't fixed the underlying things and you don't know why your existing customers love you, it's hard to make that bet, honestly. That's been one of the challenges. The other thing that I think Ellie you mentioned here is the role of advertising, and often when it is to acquire net new customers and is not targeted, um, we're seeing less of the marketing budgets go to just, except for the largest of the large, go to just general awareness marketing anymore. We're seeing a lot more performance marketing in restaurants that we didn't see 20 years ago. But yet, how do you get targeted on getting good visits, good revenue versus bad revenue, especially in an environment where um, many customers are experiencing a brand for the first time on a third party marketplace?
I mean, I have worked for brands for getting too targeted can be kind of challenging because you do want all of your targeted performance media works a lot better when you are continually refilling it with awareness from mass audiences and in categories that are really competitive in advertising. If you lose share of voice there, it can have sort of some unattended, hard to measure consequences over the longer term. So all that said, as a disclaimer, I think two things I would say about that question. One is I think the wisest thing is to build in your performance media first, because you're meeting some table stakes in a category where you will not be seen. You will not be seen if you don't. It's a little harsh to say, but a pay to play thing. So we can hope that our content will be so creative that it breaks through and is seen without us paying a dime for it. But that ship has sailed a long time ago, where really those things have been monetized. So I would consider things like search, paid search terms, and search engine optimization straight away as must haves. Must put that in the bottom of your buy. And then the other thing I would call out is CRM. I think I have seen a lot of great examples of places that have not invested in the part of their tech stack that really helps manage their CDP so that they can send personalized messages. And this is a hugely valuable part of creating that loyalty loop with your guests in a way that's really salient to them. So I would not, I've seen this a few times where it's tagged on as, really I'm more focused on loyalty and acquisition and getting names and numbers. But they are really not, I mean, it's a little bit hyperbolic, but not worth much if you haven't put the diligence in on CRM front. So I think those are the three things I would say about that. There's a place for mass, make sure your search is good, and don't underestimate CRM.
Yeah, I wonder if Andrew, from your diligence, you have kind of a rule of thumb that you might share, or maybe it's your secret bread and butter. But I can tell you some metrics that I have seen in restaurants that are pretty predictive of future bankruptcies. Um, One, they have very low capture rate in their CRM. So the amount of their revenue that they can reach with a personalized message is very low. By definition, that means you just are screaming out into the wilderness and hoping that it works. That's a very expensive strategy. Two, their activation to third purchase. If that virtuous cycle's working, when you get someone to make a first purchase, you have a high likelihood of getting them to come back a second and third time. When that virtuous cycle's not working, you see a lot of bounce. Spending any money to acquire customers, if you're not naturally activated to third purchase, is a very bad use of money. And three, we have seen brands are way heavily discounting Often I include discounts in the discount to the consumer, but also the take rate of your partners, third party, and the advertising spend. And if you add all of that up and consider that your discount, there is really a difference between good revenue and bad revenue. Does that align with your cheat sheet, Andrew? Are you willing to share some of the things you look for as your rule of thumb?
Well, we have a lot of cheat sheet items, but I would say when it comes to this, most brands that we make an investment in and add them to the Savory portfolio, they're not discounting, they're not heavily in 3PD, and they're doing things to where in QSR casual or fast casual, we like to see consumers coming at a minimum 1.5 to 2 times a week. So when we look at their loyalty data, we want to know that those consumers are coming often and that it's a habitual trend for them to be coming to that brand on a consistent basis. When you go into a brand and they tout that they're 60-70% digital and they're not even a ghost kitchen, I'm like, that's not good, because if you go into new markets and the only way that you're going to be able to do the revenues that you're showing me is by doing digital or 3PD, we usually walk away from those brands because I don't think that's a scalable brand. So there are pieces of that we look at. And for Savory, we look at brands that are doing it right, because typically the brands that we're looking at are a little bit smaller. They're emerging. So when I say emerging, 5 to 15 units, those brands have serendipitously grown over the years, 10, 15 years before we show up, in a way where they have to have a relationship with their guests. And the only reason that they've survived and are performing so well is because they're just going back to the good old create a relationship with your guests and they're going to want to come and support you. Everybody wants to give their dollar to someone they like. Don't we all? Like all four of us on this call, we're like, I want to go give money to Meredith if she owns a business because she makes me feel good when I walk in and she knows my name. That's where I'm going to go put my dollars. And I think we make it too difficult, or we make it more complex than that. I would say that the other ones are the ones that pause and perfect their business from time to time. And I think that right now, what we're seeing with the markets is people trying to scramble to make it work, but keeping everything the same in their business. And it's crazy for me too, because we just got through board season over the last month. We meet with all of our executive teams with all of our brands, and we sit in a room a whole day, if not a week, and we pause and perfect our business and we make decisions. And sometimes that means you might have to cut a couple people out of your SG&A because we're not going to lose money in a brand as we're growing. So pausing and perfecting your business is another reason why people think, well, time will pass, we'll figure this out, we'll raise money, we'll refinance our debt, we'll fix the problems. And then if you don't, what now? Well, you're bankrupt, or you're a brand that has no more legs below it. So I would say pausing and perfecting is something that is a muscle that most people don't have. And when we watch people that have exercised that muscle, we're much more interested. Think about the pandemic and what we all experienced during that time. People say all the time, oh my gosh, Andrew, during the pandemic, was that so hard? I'm like, yeah, it was hard as hell. Did you guys suffer? I'm like, no, it was my most profitable and probably one of my most favorite times in my entire career. Why? Because we galvanized as a team, we perfected the businesses, we pivoted daily, and we galvanized our relationship with our consumer too. There's nothing like it that I've ever experienced in my life like that. But then things get kind of sloppy again, where people are like, oh, everything's back, so let's just go back to just being crazy. Those actions is what's leading to some of these brands falling apart, while others are pivoting, pausing, perfecting, and they're capturing that revenue. The revenue is going somewhere, just like Ellie said, it's going somewhere. I just want to be in the bucket where it's coming to me, and if it's not going to those guys, it's because they're responsible for those actions.
Yep, I completely agree. Meredith, you wrote the book on digital transformations. I'm going to call it the book for the purpose of this discussion. And so, what are some of the things that, uh, you don't have to call it any names, but people obviously didn't learn X, Y, and Z lessons from the book. That's part of it here. And you mentioned the comparison to retail, to travel. There are still some lessons that are not ubiquitous. What are some of those things that you feel are these are the obvious ones that the industry is missing still?
Yeah, I think the first and most obvious one is probably ceding your business to someone who is not you. And for restaurants that have, I would say 30 to 40% plus of their business coming through a third party of some kind, that is a warning sign. And I remember early on in this journey, I met a woman, a restaurateur in New York, who, of course, was further ahead on this whole delivery journey than the rest of us, right? Seamless had been around in New York for a very long time. And she said, what happens when delivery becomes 40% of your business is that it is your business. And it no longer makes sense to think of it as marginal or incremental. It is your business and you have to design your business around it. And I think there are many brands, several on the list of bankruptcies, who, and maybe this is the part that's related to COVID, as Ellie started out at the very beginning, who ceded, 30-40% of their business to the third parties. And because of that, they're now very dependent on them. They now need those sales in order to survive. They become, therefore, very discount happy, I'll call it, when they're trying to make sure that they're getting their fair share. The one table filing that was probably the most illuminating on this front, even though they haven't said anything public, was that they were really dependent on a revenue guarantee that they had coming from the third parties. And they assumed that that revenue guarantee would always be there. And they made decisions about their growth rate, about their debt, based on the expectation that this revenue guarantee would always be there. And a couple things happened to them. Number one, the revenue guarantee became lower. And then number two, even worse, the revenue guarantee, in order to be fulfilled, became discounts on their P&L, right? And you can see how very quickly, when your business is dependent on someone who is not you, who you do not control, they can make decisions that are better for their business and not as good for yours.
I'm going to move off of the third party topic. We could go all day, but before I do, I just want to chart a course that I'm seeing right now and see if any of you have some reactions or can share with it. There was a period in the beginning of third party where it was, hey, this is all incremental, so it's good news. I don't have to worry about my margin. It's shocking how often we heard that. Luckily, we're past that point now. There's an awareness that that's not the case. But then there was a period, well, I can't take price on third party because it'll confuse my customers. And if my pricing's different, that's going to be problematic. Luckily, we're past that. It's generally accepted to take price to protect your margin on third party. There is now a place where it's, hey, these are customers that I can acquire and they're net new. And we're kind of back into the previous version through advertising of, hey, there's this sexy advertising thing and it's got great return on ad spend. Of course it has great return on ad spend. It's the highest intent ad channel I can ever think of. These are people about to eat food, right? So
They're
it's a brilliant advertising model for DoorDash, for Uber. We have to think as an industry, do we just want to be suppliers? And if we just want to be suppliers of food, the problem is we can be replaced with the next supplier of pizza, the next supplier of burgers. We're interchangeable. And that's an existential question I think the industry has to ask. And if we don't want to protect certain brands and we just want to be suppliers of food, we're just going to see more bankruptcies and more of that. The last one is a shocking story that I'll share because I'm just trying to show the evolution of how what Meredith just said happens. I had a conversation with a fairly large scale brand that has received an offer from one of the third parties to power their first party digital experience. The offer is free. So the idea that they can replace what is likely 6 figures or 7 figures of spending on their own first party user experiences with a free solution that's proven in market to work, pretty tantalizing. It's just yet another way to lose control of your customer to someone who now owns your customer. It's very dangerous. But what Meredith just described are the number of fronts in this battle to retain control of your customer is just constantly expanding, right? And that makes the job super hard. I guess, Ellie, I'll ask you one question on that. Are there ways that you have seen to bring alignment with the third parties a little bit more, where it's not just being forced to discount? Are there ways that you think are win-wins, or is that still kind of, taking your machete to the wilderness and still trying to find a path forward?
I do think that there are places for win-wins. I haven't had the same experience you described of having a great return on ad spend. That could be related to the amount of digital transactions that are going through the third party. So if you have a small amount, your media, and you could take that media dollar and spend it anywhere that would drive all your channels, then I've had the experience where I wanted to do that. And but I needed to put it on third party to be visible at all, to defend my share at all. And so I would say that's one place that you can find a balance, is how much do I need to, if you think about your presence on that marketplace as I need to defend share, I need to be present here, versus I need to drive a bunch of awareness. I'm using this as a high ROI media channel, but rather sort of, it's a kind of a mental model to think about your media dollars going to fuel your whole business and support your whole brand. Then you can start to think about the amount that should go here and what I get for it. Its job is much more about being visible as a brand and defending my share. So I think that's one way to create a more sustainable investment on those channels. The other one is if you do white label a first party partner, say you don't have a delivery infrastructure of your own and you need to pay to use somebody else's delivery infrastructure. I think if you can manage an arrangement where all of the marketing, all of the experience, all of the data, the entire guest experience, except for the delivery, is controlled by your brand, that can start to be a partnership that works well. Because if you don't want to get into the business, for example, of having a fleet of delivery drivers, or you don't want to partner with another group that can make that happen, then you can find a way, as long as you keep the data, you control the ordering experience, they're in your channels, they get put into your CRM system for what you want to market them for next. I think those two are ways to create some balance there. Both are still not great, I'll say. So I haven't really had an experience where I'm delighted by a mutually beneficial arrangement. But I think you can find your way to one that serves your needs, especially in those two spots.
I would add only this, that coming from the tech arena as a tech CEO, the one thing that is sure about the tech arena is that you like how I just got myself on that, Zach?
This is
uh,
a family show, Andrew.
I was gonna say, is it a family show? The one thing is that definite surety is the fact that disruption happens in tech. It's just as we just know it's going to. And when there is a business that has as much hatred towards it as we all do in the F&B industry towards 3PD because of how the business model is structured, I don't think consumers want all of us just to be food suppliers, not have brick and mortar, and just to be shoveling a product out the door. And I think the 3PD providers thinking that that's what the future is, I think they're grossly misaligned with what we really are doing here. We're creating experiences and connection with guests and giving them a place to break bread with family, friends, coworkers. That will never go away and it'll never be replaced by tech. It just will not. It's part of humanity. And so I think the disruption is coming. I wish it would come faster. But I do believe that those 3PD providers should be looking over their shoulders for what's coming, because there's no way any of us, if we find a better mousetrap, are not going to drop them and go to something that supports what we are.
That's right. And the brands that are doing this well are finding ways to lean into what they can offer that you can't get on 3P. And so
Mhm.
you're seeing exclusive access to items that you can't get on 3P. You're seeing convenience of one-click reordering the thing you love, which you can't get on 3P, because when you go there, you're overwhelmed by too many damn options. That's a strength of theirs. It's also a weakness. If someone wants less mental energy, going direct to the brand that they know they love and clicking one-click reorder is a lot less mental energy, right? And then you're seeing unique experiences and just, actually delightful in restaurant moments that you could never get through those channels.
I think
Meredith,
if I
I was
could, yeah.
damn, and I was gonna say shit, and I thought this was a family program. So, Zach, you broke the rule.
I,
Go ahead, Ellie, I'm sorry.
yeah, that's okay. I was just going to pile on with another bolstering thought to what Andrew just said regarding tech companies. And I think we saw, Meredith, you'll know the time frame better than me, but maybe 3 years ago, there were so many tech companies with a belief that they can cook a great meal and offer a great meal in sort of any kitchen, anywhere, set up any kind of way with any kind of food and any kind of skilled worker. And this sort of chapter of, you know, being a great restaurant really underserved the component of making great experiences with food because there was such emphasis on tech. And I think we've seen in the course of the last few years that that's, as we all know, because we all work in food, that's not the case. You cannot saunter up to we'll make the food and it'll all be fine. Like that's the main thing. That's it. That's the whole thing. Is this food great? Is it something I could never make myself at home? Is this something I'm going to crave every Thursday night? Something I want to tell my friends about? And I think we saw a few years ago when tech companies underestimated the impact of that.
Yeah, and what brands are truly, Ellie, is a shorthand for all of those things, right? A
Yeah.
brand stands in my mind for it's going to be a good value, it's going to be a good experience, it's going to be consistently served, it's going to be something that I like. Whatever the criteria are, that's what the brand stands for, right? And so the
Yeah.
assumption that you don't need a strong brand standing for all of those things in the consumer's mind, I think was erroneous.
Mhm.
Let's talk labor and regulatory for a second, because there are certainly some people that are listening to this that would wonder how we waited so long. Um, some have pointed out that there is a heavier penetration of these bankruptcies in places where there's been a stricter regulatory environment, particularly around labor, California being one obvious example. Um, is that just the straw that broke the camel's back, as some would say, and it's really kind of multifactorial as we've described? Or, or is it causal? And should the industry be alarmed of, a much more rigid environment coming?
I think that it was the straw. If I can, I'll speak up first, but I do think it's the straw. I think if you look at the moment in 2001 and then 2008, it felt like the balloon was popped by one item, right? One thing kind of caused it to happen, then everything else kind of fell apart. I feel like the last 3 years that the balloon is overpressured. It's got a lot of air in it. And I think that everything is pushing on it from all different angles on that balloon to where we don't know what's going to make it pop ultimately, whether we do a soft landing next year, whether we hit a full recession next year, or we thrive next year is yet to be seen. Nobody knows. But there's a lot of pressure on that balloon right now from all aspects, from inflation, costs, commodities, to interest rates and borrowing and real estate and construction costs and rent rates. Yeah, you throw on a 20, 30, 40, 50% increase in your labor costs. Yeah, I think it's a straw. That is the exact example of government getting in the way of businesses, SMBs especially, not understanding that what they caused to happen here is too much pressure on that balloon. And yeah, I think it popped for many of these groups because there's just too much pressure on us. Can you still work through it? Of course, there's people doing that left and right everywhere. But if you're in some of these markets or these districts where you're getting pushed to $20 an hour, Zach, there's no way if you're already operating at a 7, 8, 9% store level EBITDA number, you can't do it. You're done. But like I was saying earlier on this conversation, if you're running at 17, 18, 19, 20, and you've got to give 2, 3, 4% or 3 or 4 points to additional labor while you try to figure out a more efficient labor program, you're toast, right? You just can't do it unless you actually have profit before that comes. And that's why some of them are finding ways to get through this just fine.
There are restaurant openings happening in California, quite a few
Yeah.
of them, actually.
And they're doing
And they are often the healthy brands, as you've pointed out. And yes, many of them are doing just fine. That is this innovation cycle that you're describing. It's, do you have room to take on the shocks is one of the trends that you all have mentioned several times. And I think as an industry, because of all these things going on, we have to maybe get in a mode if we want to avoid ongoing bankruptcies. We have to get in a mode of leaving a little bit more room to accommodate shocks and thinking a little bit longer term. It's one of the downsides of operating 6 inches in front of our faces. There's no room for the surprise that's around the corner.
we're,
Um,
we're all just like this. Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
We agree with that.
That's true.
I agree wholeheartedly, Zach.
Nothing to add, Zach. Good job.
Parting thoughts from each of you as we see this massive wave going on, and I'll start with just one to. I don't think we're in the home stretch. I'd be interested in each of your reactions, but I actually think we're in early innings still of this wave of bankruptcies, which is why I wanted to pull together the great minds of the industry to talk about this. Where do you see where we are on these things? And what maybe the other part is, what's the green shoot that perhaps you haven't seen it yet, but that you would want to see to feel like, oh, we're likely to see that chapter in this industry behind us?
Well, I'll agree with Andrew that there are many wonderful things about this industry and there are many wonderful players. I mean, there's $1 trillion a year spent on food away from home, and consumers want it. They continue to want it. They want more and more of it over time. The way I would say it is my grandmother made my mom's clothes. My mom made some clothes for me. I've never made a single thing for my son, right? Like that in just those generations, sewing at home went away. And I believe the same thing is happening with restaurant food, that by the time my son grows up, cooking will be a hobby. It will be something that people do out of passion, not out of need, if they can afford it. There's just a long, slow, steady march towards greater convenience. And within food away from home, QSR has grown more rapidly. Why? Because it's more convenient. Delivery has grown more rapidly. Why? Because it's more convenient. So huge industry, consumers want it. They value the convenience. They value the experience. As Andrew said, for those that are more dine in, they value the human connection. That is always going to be there. But I also agree with you, Zach. We're going to see more bankruptcies. And the seeds to those bankruptcies, as we started at the beginning of this call, were planted many years ago by folks taking on too much debt relative to what their business was capable of sustaining. Assuming, as Andrew said, that the good times were always going to be good and that therefore you could lever up to expected sustained good times. And we're going to see the fruits of that come with additional bankruptcies as they face high interest rates, as they face declining transactions, as they face the cost of aggressively discounting to try to get people to come in, as they face overdependency on a third party. All of these things that we've laid out, for those brands who are stuck in that doom loop, I think we're going to see a few more of these. Now, for those brands that are like, "Ooh, that might be me. How do I get out?" I think the first step is recognition. There's a great opportunity here, and if you see that you're starting to go down that path, I think there is something that can be done about it.
I'll pile in behind Meredith because she made me bolstered up a couple things I was thinking of and closing thoughts. The first thing that comes to mind for me is that we are living through right now another, and we will have another at some point, but sort of value wars. And so we are in a space where to compete, especially in the heavily penetrated QSR, fast casual, full service space, people are offering wild discounts that are not profitable, and so the race to the bottom of that is very hard to resist when you're seeking to get through this quarter and the next quarter, and your competitor is stealing share from you with their discounts. So I think that both the thought on awareness of that is what's happening here. We are in value wars. We have been in value wars before, and we will be again. And finding the ways that your brand can offer great value to the guest that is sustainable. And just to give like a click more detail on that, I think the best ones are able to offer something the guests can count on all the time. So it's sort of one value proposition, maybe two value propositions. You stick with it, you repeat that message, you've got value here. Yes, we're here for you, but it's not sort of spray and pray wild discounting everywhere, is one I would say. As we are in a value war time, we've been there before, we'll be there again. Try to come up with ones you can rely on over a long period of time. And there are sort of some rules of the road for how to do that. And then the second thing I'll say as a takeaway is that as much as the channels that guests are accessing our brands through change, and the technology we use to provide that access and communicate it changes. What doesn't change is the power of offering something distinct and relevant, and creating experiences that guests count on and really want. So I think in times where I've seen leadership teams sort of devolve into spending all their time talking about how they can make the most margin possible, or we're doing this promotion so that we can sell this many more of something. When the conversation starts turning with hours of very senior people toward those kinds of topics and away from what problem does this solve for my guest and how much stronger is my brand over time because of the thing I just did, that's a trap. So watch out for how your meeting time is going, like your literal day. What are you talking about in what hours of each day? Because if it's not about your guests, your team members, your brand, you're going to have a long-term problem.
Wow, inspirational right there, both of them. So the only thing I would add is that I'm an eternal optimist. So if there's going to be a bunch of pessimists in a conversation, I'm usually not in that circle. I lean in on all markets because I've lived through multiple cycles in my career. And like I said earlier, all bad cycles pass and all good cycles pass. And unfortunately, we're in one right now that's a down cycle. I rest easy at night and I wake up very calm in the morning thinking we're going to be okay. But I also think, what are we doing today to make sure that we are healthy and that we're pivoting based on what data I have today? I think if anybody is sitting in a room saying, well, this bad time's going to pass, I'm just going to wait, you might not have enough time to wait because this could be long cycle. Like you said, this is early innings. I think it's early innings too. But even if we do see more drip into the bankruptcy or closure of complete, failure of a brand, it's okay because we're only seeing a very small microcosm of those brands in this market. Like Meredith said, there's $1 trillion being spent away from home just because a couple people go out of business, and that was $50 to $200 million of those sales. That doesn't mean the whole industry is going down. So we have to make sure that we don't overreact to some very small items that are happening within the industry when there are a lot of great people in this industry that are pivoting and are finding ways to stay profitable despite what headwinds we have right now in it. So for us, we're going to invest into hundreds of millions of dollars of more growth this year, next year, and the following year, because we feel like there's always opportunity in the margins. And right now, you got to look for opportunities in the margins. But back to what Ellie just said too, focusing on building yourself a great long-term brand is always the right decision. Trying to solve for things for the next day or week are not the right decisions. So I would just say focus on long-term, pause and perfect, and cut expenses you don't need right now because you might be overly bloated with expenses that you just don't need. Pause and perfect your business. Let's survive it through this industry together, and there are sure to have better days ahead.
Completely agree. We are in this industry because we have a passion for it. All of us, all four of us, and frankly, all of the many, many workers servicing customers for restaurants at every level. That passion gets us through what we can all agree is a very challenging business to run at every level. I think we should lean into that passion, but not be afraid of change. Um, change comes. Change is driving some of these things, but often the story that I've heard through this conversation is seeing the change and not being willing to adapt, not being willing to pause and perfect. I love that phrase, Andrew. And if we can do that, we see brands who are struggling, who are seeing comps go down, and instead of chasing immediate solves, they actually take a moment and adapt. I have a lot of optimism that what we'll be having in this conversation a year, 2 years from now, whenever that cycle comes, is an actually much healthier, vibrant, uh, holistic restaurant industry. And it will be because of this difficult cycle. So I thank all of you for taking the time. As we talked about at the very beginning, I don't think this directly services any of your businesses talking about these things. It's because we care, and your investment in the industry is appreciated by me, and I think by a lot of people to listen to it. So it was a pleasure, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Zach.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for bringing us together.